Welcome back to Strategic Advice. I'm Phil Haun. This year, I'm a visiting scholar at the Dartmouth College. I'm also a professor at the Naval War College, and I'm joined today with a wonderful person, a colleague, Amanda Rosen, who's also at the Naval War College, and she's the interim director of the Writing and Teaching Excellence Center. And I will say a caveat that the views expressed today are our own, do not reflect those of our institutions. Well, Amanda, welcome to Strategic Advice.
Thanks, Phil. Great to be here.
All right, it's great to have a true expert when it comes to teaching at the highest levels. And I'm so thankful that you've been willing to come and share some of your expertise. And so let's just get right into it. You've got you signed up for a tough topic, which is grading and feedback. And we've talked about this a lot, and I can't wait to hear what you have to share. So you've got it.
Great. So I do think that grading and feedback is one of the real challenges for early career instructors. We all have experience on the other side of the classroom, being a student, so we get a sense of what it's like to give a coherent lecture or how to put together a series of topics that connect. But grading and feedback is kind of the hidden piece of it. We see the results of it, we see the grade we get, but we don't necessarily see how a professor got to that point. So for this session, I want to focus on 4 strategies and 5 tips. Strategic advice, so I'm going to go with strategy. So strategy number 1 is to separate grading from feedback. These are actually 2 separate things that we often conflate. So grading itself is the assigning of a score. It's a determination of whether or not the student achieved the objective or where on a spectrum they achieved an objective. So it should be responsive to a set of criteria. Feedback instead is more of maybe the justification for why someone got that grade. But actually, if you think about feedback, it can be divided into formative and summative. So summative feedback is that justification piece, but formative feedback is the input that we give to students on works in progress to help them develop and build their skills and knowledge. It's not necessarily requiring a grade. So one of the strategies is to figure out whether the assignment that you're looking at requires grade, feedback, both, or neither. Sometimes it's simply a complete or not complete, done. You don't actually need to assign a grade to it. That can be really good for low stakes assignments that you want to give early on, or if you have a weekly assignment where you want students to put some effort in, they need to get it, show that they've done it, but they don't necessarily need a ton of feedback on it. A grade should be given for final assignments for certain, and other assignments, it can be used as a great motivator. But sometimes you can assign a grade without giving feedback. So Phil and I, we talked about this, right? So you can take an assignment that's due at the very end of class, say a final paper that they're not going to ever do again, not going to work on, not going to publish, not going to put into another draft of any kind. Why are you going to spend a lot of time putting feedback on that paper? The answer is usually trying to justify a grade. But you probably don't need to actually give that much feedback in order to justify the grade. So instead, maybe on final papers, you just give a grade, and then you invite students to request more feedback if they want it. That's a good time-saving thing that we'll get to in a second. So that's strategy number 1, separate grading from feedback. Strategy number 2, focus feedback on works in progress, not final products. So I just teed that one up. When you're thinking about what assignments need grading and what assignments need grades and what assignments need feedback, give the feedback on the work that they're doing throughout the course that's going to help them do better on the final assignments. I think we forget this piece. We don't ask students to turn in drafts or outlines, but that's actually often where they need help. Why not give them help at that point rather than waiting for them to turn in a final draft of something where they didn't do a great job because they didn't get the advice earlier on? On early drafts, great time to give a ton of feedback. Later drafts, maybe not as much. Strategy number 3 is to encourage student investment in the feedback process. So as a teacher, you often have the experience of spending a lot of time giving feedback only for the student to glance at the grade and then not anything else. And then that's a waste of your time and a waste of theirs. So what you can do instead is ask students to invest in the feedback process. So one way to do this is through student conferences. So if a student hands a final paper to me, I will tell all my students, I am happy to give you feedback. If you want the feedback and you're willing to invest the time in getting it, then I'm willing to put in to give it. So if you come and meet with me for half an hour, I will give you all the feedback that you want, but you need to invest that in-person time with me or that Zoom time with me for me to invest that time in you, because many students don't actually really, they want to read the feedback, they want to know why they got the grade, but they don't want to use the feedback. So it's a way of saying, I'm going to give you this extra feedback if you're going to invest the time in it so that I know that it's going to be useful to you. And that way that you can have a better match between the students who want the feedback and the amount of time it's going to take you. So that's strategy number 3. Number 4, use time-saving tools and processes. And here I'm going to use the R word, which is rubrics, which a lot of faculty don't like because they find it restrictive. And that is the point. Rubrics constrain us. And in a good way, they tie our hands by making us determine what the criteria are going to be for success before the students turn in the work. And that's helpful to the students. It's very transparent. They know what you're looking for. They know what you value. And then it makes the work more consistent. It makes sure that the student you grade first is going to get the same grade they would get as if you graded them last. It also provides feedback in and of itself. If you have a good scoring rubric, you can circle where on the rubric they fall, and they're getting feedback without a lot of work from you. I think rubrics have been shown to give more fair and equitable outcomes, and I think they also make the work a lot easier. So I really recommend investing in rubrics early on. All right, so those are 4 strategies. And then I want to give 5 tips on how to give better feedback, right? So if you've determined feedback is required, how do you give better feedback? The first thing is to prioritize higher order issues. This is something we push a lot in the Writing Center. When students come to us for help with writing, it's pretty rare that what we need to do is focus on grammar or sentence structure or passive voice. Sometimes that's required. Most of the time, the issue is structure, argumentation, use of evidence, these kind of higher order concerns. And so when you're giving feedback, it's really particularly formative feedback. It's really helpful to focus on those and not so much on grammar and spelling. Unless grammar and spelling are a learning outcome you care about, you probably shouldn't be spending a ton of time on them unless it's so distracting that it interferes with meaning. The second tip is to offer clear and actionable suggestions. And here I want to go after something I used to do. I used to write needs more development or argument underdeveloped. And that meant something to me. I am not convinced now that it meant anything to the students who received that as a comment. What does that mean for an argument to be underdeveloped? What is the actionable item for them to do based on that? So instead, think about what you're asking students to do. Maybe what you actually mean is the evidence you're using here isn't high quality, or you have insufficient evidence, or your claim isn't strong, or the analysis showing us how the evidence ties to your claim isn't quite there. And knowing that, here's what I recommend for next time. And so giving more clear and actionable suggestions, I think, is another helpful kind of feedback to give. A third thing to do is to provide feedback as close to the point needing attention as possible. So a lot of us like to just put comments at the end. And that's fine so long as the student knows what you're referring to at the end, where in the paper that happened. So you can do that descriptively, or you could put numbers or markings in the paper to indicate what you're talking about. But the student it's really nice to actually do inline comments where appropriate. But at the same time, you don't want to overwhelm students with too much feedback. If you give them too many things to look at, then they're not going to know where to start. The fourth tip is to include resources on how to fix the issue. So the whole idea behind formative feedback is you're trying to help students improve. And sometimes the way to do that is to provide them with resources. So maybe you point them to a site like Purdue OWL, if their issue is with citations, or you might want to show them to an academic journal where they might find really helpful resources to improve their evidence. This doesn't have to be in the paper itself. This could be when you're giving the papers back as an announcement to the whole class. But you should think about what resources, both on campus and off, you can offer to students that are seeing problems. And then my final tip is compassion and encouragement, right? These are vital to student confidence. And if all of your feedback is really negative and red pen, the student is going to feel really demoralized. And I felt this myself in graduate school. When I was in graduate school, I turned in a paper to one of my professors. And when he handed it back to me, the first 3 pages were covered in red ink. And I read through those comments and I didn't know what to do, but I did notice that after the first 3 pages, the red ink started to die off. So I went to talk to my professor and I said, it looks like that my introduction really wasn't great, but that my writing improved. And he said, no, I just got really tired of putting comments on. So I stopped. That is a paper I never published because I never wanted to go back and fix it so that it would be good enough. And so you don't want to be that professor who discourages a student from pursuing an idea because they feel like it's that bad. You have to remember that, particularly at this stage, when you're talking about undergraduates or graduate students that you may be teaching, it's really, you really need to build their confidence and not tear them down. So remember, as you're giving feedback, to insert the positive feedback, tell them what they did well, help them feel like, yes, you may have made errors, but here's how you fix them. That's the reason behind these. So yeah, so I guess those strategies are about how to make giving feedback more and grading more efficient. There's a lot more I can say about it, but I'm hopeful that those strategies and tips will get you all started.
Well, what a fantastic discussion. So I could ask you questions all day. I wish I was in your office to do that. Can you tell me a little bit about the difference between oral and written feedback as far as what's useful for the students?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of ways to give feedback. You could just record it on your phone and submit it as an audio file. You can do a face-to-face conference. There are some faculty that grade with the student next to them. That's kind of how we do writing conferences in the Writing Center, in fact, is that we go through it and give the student feedback, and you have a conversation so they can explain their thinking and you can explain yours. So that's more in person, or you can do the written form. I think a lot of us assume it needs to be in writing, and sometimes it's not actually that helpful because the tone, the handwriting, it can all get really difficult. So in terms of how students learn, you could even give it open to the students. Let them get the feedback the way they would find it most useful. So I'm usually a fan of flexibility and choice, and I think that giving that as an option to students is a great idea.
Okay, and I have one last question, which is differences between how you provide grading and feedback to undergraduates versus graduate students. Is there anything different with that?
Yeah, so graduate students are actually usually my exception to my rule about not giving feedback on final drafts. And that's because graduate students are usually producing papers that they may want to go on and publish, and certainly it's building their knowledge and their skills. So even if I might not see them again in class, they would be part of my program, and I have an enduring responsibility to them. So typically with graduate students, I would give comments on final papers with the idea of, if you wanted to go on and publish this paper, here is what I might recommend. Whereas with undergraduate final papers, I tend to be much more, I will give you feedback if you want to make the investment with me. And if not, if all you want is the grade, that's fine. You don't have to request feedback to get into my good graces. In fact, an honest student who says, actually, I just want the grade, makes me just as happy, because it means neither of us are wasting time with each other. The other thing with graduate students is often the grade spectrum is often shorter with a graduate student. You know, we think of like the B- as the graduate student F. So, you know, the feedback there, I think, is even more important than the grade. Whereas undergraduate students tend to be, the grading spectrum is a bit longer, and they may not be quite as invested in the feedback because your class might be the only political science class that they're taking. And so they may not necessarily care about it more long-term, but they might. And so I think the main difference is that in graduate school, with graduate students, you get to know each individual student a lot better than you might if you have a lot of undergraduates. And so you might make assumptions about the undergraduate students and their interest in the subject that you would not necessarily make about the grad students. So I think remembering that all of our students are individuals, that they bring different preferences and different needs, and trying to figure some of those out early on, and by just asking them what they would find valuable. The only thing to keep in mind is that sometimes students don't know what's actually valuable for their own learning. There's been a lot of research on that shows that students may think they learn better one way and actually learn better another. We're going to come to that in another session that we're going to have. So kind of keeping that in mind, that, you know, they're individuals, they may have preferences. Sometimes those preferences, when possible, you definitely want to accommodate those, and other times you have to sometimes think about, well, if they're graduate students, what do they need to do in order to be successful in the field?
All right. Well, great. Well, believe it or not, 15 minutes have flown by. That's the time we have today. Thank you so much, Amanda, for joining us at SSP Strategic Advice. Have a great day.
You too.